Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Supply Chain School Lunch and Learn. We're going to be talking about best practice in low carbon fuels. My name is James Cadman. I'm your facilitator for the day. I work for an organisation called Action Sustainability. We're the company behind the Supply Chain School that provides all the content that you listen to and watch. I'm here today with my colleague Imogen Player, who's going to take you through some polling a bit later on in the session, and also our guest Mike Jerome from Speedy Hire, fuels manager for Speedy Hire, who's going to give you the content today on HVO in particular. Quite clearly, there's a lot of drive for lower carbon emissions from all the things that we do and buy and use, and plant and equipment is no exception. And there's been a lot of discussion in recent months, well, the last couple of years probably, about HVO and alternative fuels. So we've had many requests through the school to provide some content on this. And today's Lunch and Learn session is one of those responses to give you some of the facts and figures behind what HVO is about to help you make your own decision with that. Just push on my next slide. So our agenda for today is obviously an intro and welcome from me, and then we're going to do a short Menti Meter poll, 6 or 7 questions in a few minutes that Imogen's going to run just to get your input on your current use or planned use of HVO or otherwise. Then I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to give us a great presentation on the ins and outs of HVO, the benefits, where you get it from, all the ins and outs and so on. And then there's going to be an opportunity for some Q&A. So if you would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. You'll see on your screen somewhere 2 little speech bubbles with the letters Q&A underneath. If you can use that, that'd be great. We'll try and get through as many questions as we can, so please don't be disappointed if we don't get to your question. And I will try and bunch those questions together. I think, if I'm not wrong, that there's also a function in Zoom where you can upvote someone else's question. So if you see someone's question that is largely the same as yours, you can like it basically, and it pushes it up the rankings, so it's more visible to me. Okay, we are recording the session as well, and any slides that you're going to see are also going to be provided afterwards. I think that might be on the next slide, sorry about that. So yes, we're going to talk about the Menti Meter. I've talked about the Q&A. We are going to provide the slides afterwards as well as a PDF along with a feedback form. So if you want to take notes, please do, but you will be getting a PDF copy later on this week. Okay, so that's us all set up. In terms of Menti Meter, the next stage, if you have ever been on a Supply Chain School event, webinar, business bites, workshop, you've probably used Menti Meter in the past. I'm sure there's probably no one left on the planet who hasn't used Menti Meter by now. But if you haven't, it's simply www.menti.com. You can do that on your phone. If you have one, you can do it on your laptop. You just open up another browser, simply put in that web address. You can download the app to your phone as well from the Google Store, the Apple Store. That's fine as well. You don't need to disconnect from this Zoom call. You can have them working in parallel. And most people find it's easiest if you use your smartphone because it's there, it's handy. You just, it just works quite straightforward. If you are using your laptop, try and do it in Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser. Microsoft Edge throws a bit of a wobbly sometimes when we use Menti Meter, so try and avoid that. And I'm going to hand over to Imogen, who's going to give you the PIN code to put into the box as you can see it, and take you through the Menti Meter. So I'm going to stop sharing for you, Imogen.
Thanks, James. I'll just share my screen, and then you will see at the top here the code. So the code is 2645806. So as James said, once you get to that Menti, the Menti page, it will ask you for a code. You put in that code there. Now we've got 8 questions to run through. So the first question, and I can see some of you already voting, which is great, is does your organisation use HVO? Is that yes, no, you don't know, or you will do soon? So we're really just wanting to get an understanding here of your current knowledge and your current use of HVO for all those, I think it was 100 odd people that we've got on this webinar at the moment. So I can see that we've got around 50 people voting there. So I will just give it a few more seconds just as we get more votes in. Starting to get a spread across here. We've got quite a lot of yeses, some no's, some will do soon. So that's why this webinar will be especially useful for you as well then, in terms of if you will do soon, what things you need to be thinking about. Now, for the interest of time, I think I'll move on to the next slide. We've got 8 questions to go through. So the next one, and you can still vote if you're still on that one, is for those that have said yes, if you do use it, to what extent approximately does it replace conventional diesel? So 100%, greater than 50, greater than 25, greater than 10, or not applicable because in the previous question you've said that you don't use it, or you will use it soon, but not currently at the moment. So again, you'll be able to see those responses coming through now. So we've got a lot of non-applicable responses at the minute. And then we've got 2 people actually that have said it's 100% replacing diesel. And I think that's now about the similar amount of people that responded to the last one. So again, you can still answer, but I'm going to move on to the next question now. So the next one is, if you plan to use it in the future, to what extent will it replace conventional diesel? So the same question, but for those of you that answered NA previously because you don't currently use it. We've got quite a few there coming in at 100% actually. So your current plan, your thinking is that you're going to replace diesel either 100% or greater than 50% there. Okay, now if we move on to the next question, have you had any supply problems in purchasing HVO? So if you've already purchased some, have you had any supply problems? A lot of don't knows, some yeses, some no's. Okay, it'd be interesting to draw out what those answers might be in answer to the question, yes, that you have had those problems. So if you want to put some more information, put that in the chat box, actually, that would be helpful to know. And then again, we'll move on to the next question as that's about the same number of people that have answered. Next question is, have you had any operational problems using HVO? So on question 5 out of 8 now. Okay, so only a couple have answered yes, quite a few have answered no, but the majority of people are at don't know, which makes sense as quite a lot of people in the beginning said that they're not currently using HVO. Okay, if we move on to question 6 now, are there any other barriers to using alternative fuels like HVO? So this is a free text option instead, so you can just write your answers in there. Okay, so we've got knowledge, cost, warranties, issues with palm oil. So a few of these things Mike's going to be touching on shortly. Traceability of source, behavior, mindset changes, that's coming out a bit. So there's an education theme that's coming out there, as well as the sourcing, engaging with suppliers. That's brilliant. That's really helpful. Long-term solutions, approval. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. We'll move on to the penultimate question now, which is what other alternative power sources are you looking into? Is that the biofuels, hybrid, electric, hydrogen, or any other power sources? So we've got hybrid, electric and hydrogen coming in the top there, with electric at the top currently. Okay, so electric is coming in at the top. Again, a final couple of seconds just to capture all of those other inputs, and then we'll move on to the last slide now. So the last question is another free text. So what is needed to encourage the uptake of alternative fuels like HVO? So same concept as before, any words, any phrases, anything that free text that you want to input in there. We get a word cloud coming up. I'm sure here that we'll be saying similar things as to what are any barriers. So what are the enablers that are going to help us to overcome those barriers? So education, buy-in, knowledge, got cost, tax, rebates coming out there, regulation as well. Confidence, I think that's an important one. Confidence, so that's in understanding what HVO actually is, understanding the long-term implications, understanding the whole picture really there. Okay, that's brilliant. I think we're coming up to the same number of people that have been responding throughout now. So do feel free to still input your response. And if you feel quite strongly that you want to give us some more information on something that we've covered, as I said, do pop it in the chat box and we can bring that out. And now I'm going to pass over to Mike. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Imogen, and thank you very much, everybody, for inputting your answers to that. We're going to provide the output from that as well, because you might find it useful, particularly those word clouds. I think they're really good to kind of scrutinise some of those big words that come out of the obvious ones, maybe, but there's some other good points in there as well. So we'll circulate that as another PDF with the slides when we get them. I'm going to introduce Mike now, who's going to give us the presentation today about HVO and all the ins and outs of it. So I'm just going to share my screen one more time. So we've got the slides up. Cool. Hopefully you can see that all okay. I'll just adjust my screen again a little bit here, my second screen, if you just bear with me a second, people. And there we go. So there we go. Mike Jerome, Speedy Services, over to you. Shall I drop onto the next slide for you?
Yeah, please, James. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Jerome from Speedy Services. I head up the fuel division for Speedy, so we've been working with HVO for quite some time. So I think this is a great session to be able to share some of the information that we've gained over the past few years and answer some of the questions. And the word clouds do really bring up some of those areas that hopefully some of the information that we'll share today will answer. So we've got a small agenda there. And you can see that, you know, some of the information, some of the words in the word clouds are going to be covered. So without further ado, one just quick mention is that Mark, who is jointly presenting with me today, is unfortunately out at the moment with a COVID issue. He's hoping to be back to be able to join us at some point, but nevertheless, we'll sort of carry on and hope he can join us at some point. So firstly, an introduction into HVO, what it stands for. So hydro-treated vegetable oil, which I'm sure a lot of people will know now. And it's a second generation biofuel. We've got the first generation biofuels, which is a product called FAME, or fatty acid methyl ester. And in the past, we've suffered sort of issues like it's hygroscopic, so we get water ingress into the product, which in turn then creates an environment for things like diesel bug growth, waxing, which then lead to things like block filters and equipment breaking down. So it's really important to note that this is a second generation of biofuels. It is something, you know, completely different in the way it's manufactured, and it has been around for quite some time, although it is gaining quite a lot of traction in the last 12 months. The process itself to create the product is hydro treatment. It turns the fats and oils into the hydrocarbons. And that's kind of almost identical then to regular diesel. The product is drop and go, so it's a very easy product to switch to. And as I say, over the last sort of 12 months, it's really grown in its popularity across the construction industry. So if you could move on, Mark, please. James, sorry. So some of the benefits. The first one is that it reduces your greenhouse gas emissions by up to 90%. Now, these are the DEFRA conversion factors that use 0.3357 kilos per litre of net CO2 emissions for HVO and 3.156 kilos of carbon, net carbon for every litre of diesel used. So those are the DEFRA conversion factors, and it's just a simple case of mathematics to multiply the number of litres of HBVO you use in comparison to diesel, and that equates then to your saving. It's a reportable one, so like I said, it's DEFRA approved, so that can be used at your end of year carbon reporting. It's a drop-in replacement for standard diesel and gas oil. There is no retrofit needed. It can be used with stage 5 engines where you've got AdBlue systems and you've got diesel particle filters, or engines prior to that as well. There's no modifications or no retrofit tasks to carry out. An important one is the standards that the HVO complies with. So ASTM D975 is the American standard for diesel fuel, and also EN 15940, which is the European standard for paraffinic fuel. So this includes things like GTL and HVO. And those two things are quite important. So when we're looking at compatibility with diesel engines, as we said, it is a direct drop and go replacement. It will work in any diesel engine. But if you want to consider things like warranties and not forfeiting those, we need to ensure that the manufacturers have approved use of either ASTM D975 fuels or EN 15940 fuels for use in those particular engines. The actual process for manufacturing the fuel is one that's very much based on producing a really high quality, very clean fuel. And because of the fact that it isn't hygroscopic, it makes the fuel much more balanced, it's much more stable, and it gives us a shelf life of around about 10 years. So that's 10 times that's recommended for diesel today because of this for the 7% FAME content that's in there at the moment. It's produced from 100% sustainable and renewable waste feedstocks. So that would be primarily used cooking oil that is then unfit for human or animal consumption. And that is the feedstock. That is certified in 2 sources, which we'll touch on shortly, but the International Sustainability and Carbon Certification Scheme, and also the UK's Renewable Fuels Assurance Scheme. Those two give us full chain of custody right from the source of collection through to the point that it's delivered to a customer. So we can ensure that the feedstock is exactly what we're saying and 100% used cooking oil. In the exhaust gases, and this is where we differentiate between that reportable carbon reduction and the actual exhaust gases, so local air quality, we start to see significant reductions in those gases, particularly in nitrogen oxide and particulate matter. Nitrogen dioxide, another, and we can start to see significant reductions into the sort of 90% across those. So people local to a site in the local neighborhood, or perhaps your own employees and workers, they all benefit from an improvement in the local air quality. And lastly to mention is the freezing point on the product. So it's good for temperatures down to -40. I think particularly important as Neste are a Finnish-based organisation and they get some extreme weather. Temperature drops in the winter, so it's usable down to -40, and the higher cetane gives it much better cold starting properties as well. So that's the sort of initial benefits. James, if you can move on for me. So the feedstock, as we mentioned before, it is a 100% renewable product. It's a completely direct alternative to mineral diesel, and it's been widely tested off-road in equipment and on-road in vehicles since 2007. So there's some 14 years of experience have gone into this. You know, the majority started off in Finland, very early days, and some significant trials across multiple types of equipment, including vehicles and public transport, to make sure that we'd got then a product that was completely usable across all types of scenarios and all types of applications. As we mentioned, EN 15940 and ASTM D975, very key standards that this is manufactured to, and those are the ones that are used to be able to discern whether the warranty would still be valid. So it's important with the manufacturers stating that those two standards are okay for use in that equipment. There is a question about age of equipment, and there have been occasionally concerns raised over the age of equipment, and this is based on the chemical makeup, and stated as a precautionary measure that potentially there could be some effect to seals where they've been exposed to diesel over a particularly long period of time. The change in the chemical makeup could potentially see seals start to degrade. We've been using this for about 2.5 years now, and across a multitude of product, and we've seen no evidence of any sort of equipment failing due to the switchover. On the contrary, what we have found is that the condition of the engine oil and fuel filters and filters in general are in much better condition than those in equipment that is using regular diesel when it's returned to us for service before it goes out to another customer. Lastly, as we said, there is no need to modify or change any equipment. You don't have to flush tanks, and you don't have to flush fuel systems. So when we're talking about vehicles, it's particularly important because you can't always necessarily get to fill up your vehicle with HVO, and it could render you sort of short of fuel and running out. So the ability to then just blend regular diesel into this gives you a safety net to ensure that you've always got the fuel available. Okay, James. So HVO performance, as we mentioned previously, the FAME content in diesel today. So when you see on your forecourt B7 and your fuel pump, you'll notice that that's got a 7% bio content, which is FAME, fatty acid methyl ester. And as we mentioned, it absorbs water, and that can lead to diesel bug growth. It can lead to waxing. And then you start to get block filters, poor performance, and then you get poor combustion. Then you lead to sort of lower power and efficiency. And once we get to those second generations in HVO, it is completely different in its makeup. The FAME content isn't there. It isn't hygroscopic, so we don't start to see those effects, particularly in winter with performance. Now, when we look at the standards, there is a standard or one of the parameters within the standards is density. Now, HVO is a slightly less dense fuel than regular diesel. So theoretically, you would start to see then perhaps an increase in use, or perhaps a slight sort of decrease in power. But actually what we see, because of the higher cetane values, which deliver better cold start properties, then you've got the additive packs in there and a much cleaner burn, which then ends up cleaning the fuel system. Those things outweigh the density element of it, and we end up with a fuel that performs equally well, with no sort of reduction in performance that we've noted to date. One of the other benefits, I guess, from this is that the fact that because there's no aromatics, and essentially then that helps to lower the particulate matter in the exhaust gases, we start to see an increased time between diesel particle filter regeneration cycles, which is quite heavy on fuel when they go through those cycles. So with those being elongated, it means that there's also then an efficiency gain from that perspective. So overall, we see that, a smoother running engine and equal performance across the range wherever we've tried it. The compatibility element of it, you'll see a number of manufacturers on the right hand side that we've got there, and all those manufacturers have approved fuel to either sort of ASTM D975 standards or EN 15940. There are a few manufacturers that use other people's engines, so the actual number of engines and engine manufacturers is actually quite small, and smaller than we would think. So the vast majority of the equipment that we see, certainly across the construction industry and higher, is covered by these engines here, and therefore we're comfortable that all of the standards required by these manufacturers are covered by our HVO. Okay, James. So onto the feedstock element of it. So within the feedstock, as I say, it's predominantly in the UK, it's a used cooking oil, and that is certified by Cargo. So the largest image that you see on the right hand side there is the biofuel sustainability statement. That's covered by the ISCC. So for each cargo that comes in, every litre is accounted for, and its country of origin, and also its actual makeup. So when those come in, we always see that it's 100% used cooking oil. So, and that's traced right back from the point of collection, be it restaurants or schools or sort of larger cooking facilities, that where it's collected, and then right through the supply chain via each cargo. And then when it gets into the UK, there's a new scheme called the Renewable Fuels Assurance Scheme. That's operated by ZEMO for the Department for Transport, and that's the UK accredited scheme. And you can see that the efficiency chart is similar to those that you would see on an electrical appliance. So you see that, you know, A is where HVO sits, and that's on the basis that it is supplied and then delivered in vehicles that are using HVO. So the whole thing is completely covered by independent bodies right the way through the supply chain until it hits our customer and end user. Okay, James. So onto the supply chain element of it, and this is one question that comes up quite often: is there enough to go around? And we've got quite a few factors that come into play on this one. So globally, there's around about 3.5 million tons of HVO production. That's ranging in European countries, Southeast Asia, and into America. But predominantly, the Neste product is produced over in Finland and the Netherlands, and that's the product that enters the UK. It's forecast to grow and reach 10 million tons by 2030. And hopefully at that point, what we'll also start to see is when we start to see the introduction of technologies like hybrid vehicles, battery powered vehicles, hydrogen, we can see the demand for the fuel starting to lift off as demand for HVO grows, and the two will meet. There's no current refining capability in the UK, which we would hope would change at some point. If the demand is there, then it certainly should be something that's looked at from an infrastructure perspective. So currently all of the product is imported from Europe, and that comes in large cargo vessels into terminals into the UK. The delivery network is not as well established as red diesel. As you can imagine, red diesel has been around for quite some time. There are lots of fuel depots and fuel terminals and lots of businesses that distribute that on a daily basis. So it's a very, very well developed network for diesel. With HVO, it isn't as well developed. It is growing, and it's growing quite quickly, but it isn't readily available. So the ability to make an order and have that delivered next day with HVO is not there yet. As I say, it will get there eventually, but it isn't quite there yet. So as demand grows, the network capability grows, we then get product closer to people's sort of work face. We're starting to see the more industrialized areas, so your southeast, Bristol and South Wales, the Midlands, northeast, northwest, they're developing quite well. But then there are some other areas that have yet to build that network to allow us to get that delivery in the similar sort of timeframes as we would sort of expect with red diesel. Currently, the big demand sits in Europe and the northern sort of European countries, Nordic countries. They've adopted this quite widely, and across the forecourt network, there are forecourts that have a 50% diesel and a 50% HVO blend readily available for users like ourselves in vehicles, and also they do have 100% HVO blend. So there's a very sort of healthy demand in Europe. As we sort of grow in the UK, the demand will sort of grow here, and so will our network, and so will the ability to bring it in and ensure that the availability is there. But we don't yet see it being part of the standard product range in forecourts, and that's probably because of the link with the oil majors. So a lot of our forecourts are all linked to the likes of BP, Shell, Esso, Texaco, whereas when we get into Nordic countries, they're more independent, so they have then a choice of what product goes into that. So we don't see that it's going to get that big uptake from a forecourt perspective quickly, so it generally would sit in the commercial world. Okay, James, we'll move on to the next one. So here, just to reinforce the previous slide, we can see where the current production sits, and the vast majority you can see is within Europe. There are other areas and sites under construction in the UAE, for example, Southeast Asia and China, some in South America, and then over towards the west coast of America. But you'll see that when we look at the capacity, Neste are considerably further ahead in its production and production capacity compared to everybody else in the world. So they are essentially currently the global leader in the refinement of HVO fuel. Okay, James. So this was one that was on the word clouds and the pricing element for HVO. It is impacted by feedstock and the demand for that feedstock quite heavily. There's three major market forces for it, which is the actual raw material costs, manufacturing costs, and distribution. So as we've seen the impact of the drivers at the moment, and they're continually sort of increasing wages, that has an effect on it. The increase in price of diesel, again, an indirect effect on the price of HVO. The one thing that we've all been used to recently is the Platts index for pricing fuel, and the general standard for a Platts plus type arrangement for fuel throughout the UK and for diesel. And that pricing mechanism is now sort of recognised, but it isn't established as a standard pricing mechanism throughout the UK currently. We're not sure if that will actually sort of happen or not, but it depends on the supplier and whether they want to participate in that currently. So the two things are not ideally sort of linked. They vary differently. So when we come to start talking about the premium over diesel and how much might that be, it is a few percent. It's generally a more expensive product. It's a higher quality product. It's got lots of other benefits as well as the carbon reduction part of it. So we do see that there is a premium for this fuel. It's hard to establish exactly what that is because, as I say, you've got those two different sort of pricing mechanisms. And in recent times, we've seen quite a sort of surge in the price of diesel, which has closed the gap significantly over what it was, let's say, a year or so ago. But what we've also got to consider is that, is this really, a like-for-like comparison? Can we really say that comparing HVO to diesel is really the fair comparison? And I think a fairer comparison would probably be to compare it to the things like battery-powered equipment or electric equipment, hydrogen, and where are they currently? And are they available? And how much is it going to cost to power a site with those types of technologies? So if we then think of those, and then we start to think then of HVO, and then we consider then the fact that there's no disruption to the supply chain, we don't have to change any of the infrastructure around delivery of HVO, and we don't have to modify or retrofit anything to our equipment. Actually, we've probably got a really, really great value for money product that can make the difference in the carbon output today. And the last thing just to mention on the pricing perspective is that HVO doesn't avoid the duty change that's due in March next year. The standard fuel duty rates do apply. James, if we can move on, we'll talk about that some more on the next slide. So from the 1st of April, and this is relatively well known now across the market, from the 1st of April, red marked fuels, and it's key to get this across, it's red marked fuels rather than red diesel. It will still be available, but it will only be limited to a restricted range of industries, and those are listed there. So the vast majority of the people that we've got on this will not be able to use a red marked fuel. So when we talk about those, any fuel like GTL, HVO, diesel has a red marking in it to signify that it's okay for off-road use. And it has a duty rate of 11.14p per litre attached to that product. For anything that we use on road, it doesn't have any type of chemical marker or dye, so it's then an unmarked fuel or a white fuel, which then has a duty of 57.94p a litre. So when April the 1st comes, red fuels will only be able to be used off-road by that range of industries that you can see listed there. So it's really key for us to say that HVO is treated exactly the same. So come March the 1st, we'll no longer be able to supply HVO, red HVO, to anybody but those industries, and that duty change will then apply to those. So looking at the responsibilities on the duty change, there's two really distinct areas for this. So your first one is a registered dealer in controlled oils. That applies to ourselves and other fuel distributors. We can only supply unmarked fuels to those industries. Sorry, we can only supply unmarked fuels, and we've got to ensure that our tanks and tankers are flush. So anything we use to distribute fuel must be cleaned out by the 1st of April 2022, and everything thereafter will be a white or an unmarked fuel unless we are supplying to one of those industries. The responsibilities from an end user are not quite as heavy. The responsibility there is that the end user cannot stockpile fuel. So the actual term is that you cannot order fuel that you cannot reasonably expect to use by the cut-off date of the 31st of March. There is a sort of an approach from HMRC that if you keep your records accurately for fuel that you had delivered up to that point, so that you can prove that no stockpiling has taken place, and you can then prove that after the 1st of April that you've only used white fuel. In the event of an inspection, if there are traces of red in that, you can show your evidence that you've complied with the new regulations, and they will accept that. So two distinct responsibilities in there, one for the registered dealers in controlled oils, and then one for those end users. Okay, James, so that's the end of those slides. Hopefully they've covered off quite a number of those questions posed, and certainly those from the word clouds, which were quite good. But yeah, happy to move into the Q&A.
Excellent. Many thanks, Mike. That was really, really helpful. You might have noticed there's been a few questions coming in on the Q&A, and I've got a few others as well. So I'm going to try and group a few of them where possible. And you'll have touched upon them to some extent already, Mike, but just kind of dig into them a little bit. You put up a lot of logos on one of the slide about the OEMs and the other manufacturers who have approved HVO, but there's been a couple of comments from different people about compatibility basically with different engines. If you just want to elaborate on that a little bit more, that some people are sensing that some machines are fully compatible with HVO, some are only compatible if it's a certain kind of HVO, and then there's linked to that, there's the warranty issue that goes with the engines. If you could elaborate a little bit more, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, to start off with, we talk about different types of HVO. They all meet EN 15940. So that's the sort of key element. And this is where we talked earlier on about the standards that the fuel is manufactured to. And so that's the one sort of part of it. The HVO sort of fuel itself, as I say, it's compatible with all diesel. It's a direct drop and go replacement. It meets all of the same criteria as the ASTM D975. I think what we find is in general is that there's maybe a lack of transfer of information coming over. So we've seen instances of distributors of equipment saying that you cannot use HVO fuel in our equipment, and what we generally find is that they're not aware of the new standards. They're not aware that the actual manufacturers have approved use of the fuels to those two standards, the ASTM and the EN standards we mentioned, and they make that comparison to those previous first generation biofuels. And we had some experience of that in the past as well, where it really does start to cause issues and block filters very, very quickly. So I think that's the sort of general position on it. There's sometimes that lack of transfer of information, and particularly from main manufacturers' headquarters, be they in sort of Europe or America or wherever, that doesn't necessarily always get right down to the point of the distributor or even the subsidiary company in that point. So it's key. The message is that it can be used in all diesel engines. The standards must be met. So if you need to ensure that your warranties are covered and you're really comfortable with using this fuel in the equipment, then check to see which standards of fuel have been approved for use in that particular piece of equipment.
Super, thanks, Mike. Hopefully there's a couple of questions on that from Stephen and someone called Anonymous. So hopefully that's answered that question. There's a couple of questions as well on I was going to say the elephant in the room. It's not really the elephant in the room, on palm oil and deforestation in terms of the source materials. And you touched upon it a little bit, Mike, in terms of where Neste get their material from. But if you could elaborate a little bit more about that risk that many people perceive of sourcing HVO, but it has a percentage content that is palm oil or derived from a plantation that produces palm oil, and obviously the links there to onward issues of deforestation, that it's not necessarily the waste oil that it's purported to be.
Yeah, so we can use the ISCC and RFAS schemes right back to the point of collection, and that's how far they go, and that's how far the chain of custody goes. As for the product that goes into that beforehand, we don't have the control over that element. But what we do have control over is the fact that it's a product that is then unfit for human or animal consumption. So it's essentially going for good use. I think one of the concerns may be that because we have now a demand for this as a product and an alternative to diesel, that will then divert what would have been the channel for using used cooking oil previously. That will divert that back to a virgin crop, which essentially could be a palm oil. Now, the palm oil has two standards. There is that is contributing heavily to deforestation. And then there's also those that are sort of palm oil plantations that are part of the roundtable for sustainable palm oil production. But as for this product, we know that they say that the actual product, the feedstock, is that of 100% used cooking oil, unfit for human or animal consumption.
Cool. Great, thank you very much for that one. And I think from my point of view, it's about those certifications that you talked about, is that kind of traceability back to as far as you can through that chain of custody. There's one specific discrete question about additives, some chemical additives that can be put into fuels, and this applies beyond HVO, it applies to other fossil fuels as well, that can potentially reduce tailpipe emissions further than kind of standard HVO. If there's anything you'd like to add on that, you know, how these additives work, or what they can actually achieve.
Yeah, we've certainly looked at it in a small amount of detail. I mean, we definitely work with sort of customer demand, and I think there is a place to do some further investigation and trial into this. I think that the issues with it is when you're putting an additive in, you need to ensure that the dosing is done correctly and accurately. That's number one. And if we don't dose correctly, what are then the sort of the knock-on effects? So that's an important issue, and then who takes responsibility for that, and how is it actually done? And then the second element to that is that if you're adding putting an additive into a diesel, then when you look to do the claimable sort of net carbon savings at the end of the year, you've essentially still burnt that diesel. So you were still contributing to 3.156 kilos of carbon for every litre used. So I think it's got its place. And I think there's further investigation should be carried out on using it, and perhaps in conjunction with HVO, because, you know, HVO isn't going to solve the climate crisis on its own, and there will be other things that sort of help with it, you know, battery technology, and using sort of HVO for a generator that charges a battery. You know, that's probably one of the best options that we can get. And I think there's further investigation needed into the additives, because that's going to really affect that local air quality. So when we're talking about, you know, built up areas, NRMM in London, ultra low emission zones, that's when that becomes particularly important. And even down to rail, when we're looking at confined spaces and tunnel work, if we can reduce the emissions, tailpipe emissions, and improve that local air quality, then I certainly think it's got a place, and perhaps in conjunction with HVO, and that's something that needs further investigation and trial.
Nice one, thanks Mike. There's been a few questions that are generally around the theme of availability, supply and demand. How do we collect? Is there any plans for collection of waste oils in the UK, and then likewise production in the UK, so we're not having to go to the Netherlands or Finland? So that kind of that you talked about the availability and being able to supply, you know, pick up the phone, I need some by tomorrow. That's still growing and developing, but that kind of the wider infrastructure behind that, what you see is the plans in the UK for in-country production and obviously all the collection that goes with it.
Yeah, it's a question I don't know the answer to currently. You know, we would hope that as our demand grows, that we would start to bring, you know, refining back to this country, and then we can eradicate the need to ship it in huge cargo vessels across the sea. And that would be obviously a more sustainable way of doing it. The numbers that we mentioned earlier on, the DEFRA conversion factors, they include the fact that this is an imported product. But yeah, if it can be refined in the UK, obviously there's a significant advantage to that. I don't know of any plans just yet, but you know, we're all hopeful that this will you know, this will grow. And I think that the point of collection is one that is a key one. So, you know, rather than the use of HVO as an alternative to diesel, rather than that, you know, diverting the use and demand for palm oil, we would actually see that as it's increasing the demand for improved recycling within the UK. We all see the McDonald's trucks with powered by chip fat or words to that effect that are driving around. But, you know, those larger chains and organisations, you know, we need to be doing more from that perspective to recycle oil, and ourselves. You know, how many of us actually sort of recycle the cooking oil? And it's probably quite a small percentage. So there's probably millions of litres that are going down the drain that could go to much better use.
No, that's great. And then there's a follow-on question from that. It's a bit of a stats question from Gerald. You put up some availability stats of, was it 3.5 million tonnes or 3.5 million litres, and what the expected growth will be? Yeah, tonnes, thank you. What the demand might be from the UK construction sector going forward in terms of those kinds of numbers?
Again, I don't know the exact numbers behind that. I mean, from a sort of literage perspective, we're talking around about 4 billion litres annually as what the capacity is coming into the UK. And then if we talked about the overall sort of fuel usage, I think we're about 14 billion litres. But of course, that includes all of that forecourt fuel, which we mentioned earlier on, is probably either going to be slow to be taken up or won't. But for the construction industry, I'm not quite sure of those numbers of what that sort of total usage would be, but I would imagine it's probably, you know, a hefty volume eating into that 4 billion litres. And then we'll start to see some people like hauliers take on that. So your more sort of advanced environmentally conscious hauliers might take that on, and they would have their own tanks and distribution facilities within their own premises. So those are where we would see it coming on road. But yeah, primarily construction. But of course, when we see that, we're also talking about the demand declining due to hydrogen, hybrid, battery power, and some of the alternative technologies that are coming in.
Cool. And that's going to be my final question, which I'll come on to in a minute. We've got a few minutes left. You're doing well, Mike, with all these being fired questions at you. We'll keep going if you may. On just feeding on from the following on from the haulier question, there's one question about blending HVO with diesel. The question quite simply is, why is there a need for a 50-50 blend if pure HVO is as good as it gets, or is as good as it's reported? Is that down to availability, or you know, people trying to manage their price and so on, or what might be the reasons behind blending?
I think two things really, availability and cost, James, on that one. So if we looked at, you know, if you've got a premium for HVO, and then you can blend it, you're making a 50% contribution towards that 90% reduction, but you're not going all of the way from a cost perspective. So, you know, when we get to March next year, there's already a significant increase because of the fuel duty. So, you know, is it some, you know, a stepping stone essentially to that that transition to 100%. And there's also blends with HVO and GTL available. So GTL being another one of these paraffinic fuels, reasonably good emissions at the tailpipe, but it is still a fossil fuel. So you've got all of those tailpipe emissions, 50% of those reportable savings. But yeah, it's a question of availability and price control.
Super. Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you. There's a question here that's a new one on me that I've never heard of. What is HVO 20 and HVO 100? Is there a difference in price and emissions? Is it like when you go to the forecourt and you can get unleaded petrol 95 or petrol 98? Is it that kind of, is it cetane number stuff?
No, it will just be the fact that it's 100% HVO. So if you see HVO 20 or HVO 100, it will indicate the percentage of that HVO content in there.
Okay, so it's simply a blending percentage. Okay, so thank you. That was a straightforward one. Okay, there's one question on air quality emissions. We talked about HVO reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, but also some of your tailpipe, your NOx and your PM. Does that apply to PM 2.5 as well as the larger PM 10 in terms of reducing tailpipe?
Yeah, it does. So there's around about a 50%. I can't remember the exact numbers now, but there's, the test that we've carried out ourselves and got the sort of the exhaust analysis done. So reduction in particles of both the sort of standard and the sort of fine particle nature. And fine particles, of course, are the ones that get through diesel particle filters. So, quite important to make sure that we've got those controlled and reduced. So yeah, it does affect both, and they're sat around about the sort of 50% mark.
Okay, super, cool. There's one question from Joel, which I'm going to finish off with my final question, so I'll leave that for the moment. Another technical question here about, is HVO treated the same as diesel for ADR transportation purposes? Are there any exemptions for small quantities?
Yes, it's treated exactly the same, UN 1202.
Excellent. Yep. Hopefully that makes sense to the person who posed that question, because for me that's just a load of numbers and letters. So hopefully that's good. Thank you very much. And the last question I'm going to ask is one that a couple of people have liked, is on the emission factors for that greenhouse gas saving. Now, obviously those all come from DEFRA, and I recognise a lot of those figures myself. So if you could just confirm, Mike, when you say there's a 90-odd% saving in GHG emissions, it's using those DEFRA, the latest DEFRA emission factors for gas oil compared to HVO.
Yeah. Yeah, so 3.156 kilos of carbon for the diesel. Now, it's important to sort of note that that's a diesel with an average biofuel blend. It's not pure diesel. If it's pure diesel, it'd be higher than that. But because there's a 7% bio content in fuel in all diesel at the moment in the UK, we've used the average bio blend diesel conversion factor, and then it's 0.3357 for HVO. So roughly there's a sort of a 90% reduction, and sort of in rough terms, it's a 2.8 kilos per litre reduction. So 357 litres will save you a metric ton of net carbon.
Super. That's great. And from those figures I'm hearing well to tank as well, not just kind of direct tailpipe. So
well to wheel.
Yep. Well to wheel. Yeah. Thank you. Super. Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike. Well done. You survived the the test. This kind of the final question for me, which, as I say, Joel has already posed, is a kind of a wider question. How long you see the kind of the lifetime of HVO? We've used the phrase stepping stone a few times. Let's move away from conventional diesel, use HVO as a stepping stone. It has the benefits that we don't have to retrofit any of our kit. We can use it as a drop-in. So it's the embodied carbon of the kit as well. Let's not chuck out the baby with the bathwater just to move on to the next thing. Let's get the lifetime out of that plant and equipment. What your kind of crystal ball gazing might be in terms of the longevity of HVO as people still are moving towards electric or hydrogen or some other power source.
I think we've put it in there at roughly a 10-year transition plan. We're seeing the technology evolve really, really quickly on battery technology. The voltage is going up, the amount of time you can use a battery for is going up, and it's evolving really, really quickly. And I've been reading up sort of recently about solid state lithium rechargeable batteries, which sort of takes that technology onto the next level, and really, really fast charging and greater capacity. So it's moving on at a speed. But like you said, if you've got perfectly sort of adequate and diesel generators that can run on HVO, and you then use those to charge things like, you know, battery powered equipment, it's probably the best, because at some point we need to be able to charge that battery powered equipment. So if we're doing it in a way that's, you know, as green as we can possibly get, then, you know, the combination of those two technologies. So we see it's going to have a place. I mean, generally, you know, our industry follows automotive. Automotive is moving on and made that commitment for 2030. So, you know, within around about a 10-year plan, we would see, you know, the follow on for that. Roughly, hydrogen is a slightly more difficult one, because there's a big infrastructure needed around it, and there's also some discussions about the two types of hydrogen, and one being green and one being not so. So I think there's quite you know, a lot more evolvement got to happen around hydrogen.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Mike. And from my part, I see it's that whole VHS Betamax thing. There's going to be several different options depending on the size and the weight and the use of the plant and equipment. So, you know, different options available out there. That's great. Thank you very much. We are almost at the top of the hour. There's a question about the actual emissions factors. We'll come back to you on that specifically, because it's obviously quite a detailed question to provide those stats. For everyone else's benefit, if you want to go and get the emission conversion factors that DEFRA and BASE provide every year, they're downloadable. It's a free Excel spreadsheet you can download from the .gov.uk website. It has thousands, literally thousands of conversion factors in there, of which some of them are on diesel, gas, oil, HVO and so on, and it covers off all the aspects of the actual direct burn, but also the well to wheel, well to tank approach to them as well. So we'll do that separately. It just remains for me to say thank you very much for Mike for flying the plane single-handedly today and taking all your questions. Just a reminder that we will have a feedback form for the audience's input in terms of what we do well, what we could do better, what else we could do, what you'd find interesting. And like I said, you'll get a copy of the slides as a PDF. So thank you very much from us, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.